Marcus Papadopoulos, I'll start with you. Looking at the most recent development that is of significance is what happened on the ground with the Russian strikes that hit a U.S. weapons, I guess, depot at an airfield near Odessa. The Russian Defense Ministry said that this was a military airfield and it destroyed a runway and a hangar containing the Western-supplied weapons and ammunition. To me, that sounds like progress on the Russian side.
Well, the response of the West to the Russian military campaign in Ukraine is not only about trying to deprive Russia of Ukraine, but it is also centered on the Western ruling elites attempting to preserve the global order which they established some 30 years ago following the demise of Soviet communism and the dissolution of the USSR. So on the one hand, by the West flooding Ukraine with all sorts of weaponry, the Western ruling elites are hoping to inflict a military defeat on the Russian army, which I should say is both fanciful and also exceedingly dangerous for global peace and global stability. And on the other hand, the Western ruling elites are trying now to preserve the global order, which has been in existence for 3 decades now, because the Western ruling elites, specifically Washington and London, are acutely aware that because of their stance on Russia, because of the sanctions they have imposed on Russia, Beijing and Moscow have become even closer. And it is abundantly clear that Russia and China are now intent on dismantling the global order which the West created 30 years ago. And as regards the military situation in Ukraine, well, the Ukrainian armed forces are virtually paralyzed as a result of potent Russian military strikes on them. Furthermore, the Russians are now systematically destroying the logistics chain of the Ukrainian armed forces, which means the Ukrainian armed forces in eastern Ukraine and in southern Ukraine will not be able to be replenished with soldiers and weaponry.
Okay. Ian Williams, it doesn't sound like you agreed with anything our guest there said from London.
It's like Alice in Wonderland, everything through a looking glass. First of all, may I wish you a happy May Day, comrades all over the world. And just to get over the binary politics, I should remind you that May Day started in Chicago. It was an American holiday. It's celebrated all the world over, usually by workers parading, not by military oligarchs and dictators parading their troops in the Kremlin or Red Square or anywhere else. So having got that ritual greeting out of the way, I'd point out who are the biggest importers of weapons into Ukraine. The Russian army brought billions of dollars worth of high technology weapons into Ukraine. No one asked them to. They brought them for free. They've been told to take them out. Oh, they want negotiations. Anytime they want peace, all they have to do is to obey international law, obey the strictures of the International Court of Justice, listen to what the rest of the world is saying, and get their troops out of there. That's all they need for peace. That's all you need. So when a bully punches someone in the face and friends come and aid the victim, oh, this is aggression. This is aggression. Let's get the perspective. It is Russian weapons, which the Ukrainians are using mostly, by the way. Most of the Ukrainian weapons supply is ex-Soviet or Russian that they bought recently from Russia. The Russian weapons is drying up. The rosy military situation that Comrade Papadopoulos talked about is not nearly as rosy. They stopped making the weapons because they relied on imported Western components, because Putin had concentrated so much on military hardware and turning the place into a failed third world petrostate, he neglected the industry. Now, he was aided in this with Western neoliberal economists who really trashed his economy for him. But he and his oligarchs were willing accomplices on this, as long as they got the money and took enough for the army. So, there's plenty of blame to go around here. But the essence of it is international law, as Guterres said. The Guterres who went on a peacemaking mission, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the Russians shelled and bombed the city that he was visiting. How is that for a gesture of peace? How is that for a gesture of good intentions? These are not equivalents. We have a brutal, rapacious dictator who has invaded another country.
Sure, let's get
Marcus.
Marcus.
Another country with loads of weapons and is not destroying logistics. He's destroying cities. He's destroying apartment blocks.
Marcus,
he's blowing up hospitals.
Let's get Marcus's response here.
This is not countenanceable by any civilized measure.
The diverging views, Marcus Papadopoulos, is very evident, because I think the U.S. is calling it diabolical when they describe Putin in some sense, and I use that because Nancy Pelosi, the U.S. House Speaker, visited Ukraine very recently. I mean, first of all, why would she visit Ukraine? I mean, I think she could have done a Skype with Zelensky to show her support, but she had to somehow make sure that she was present there. Why do you think that was? The only reason I could think of here is that she wanted to make sure that, aside from, I guess, sympathize with him and show solidarity, to make sure that Zelensky actually is continuing the war. I mean, what other reasons would she have?
Well, I think there are a number of factors, one of them being that politicians in, for example, America, sense an opportunity to make a name for themselves. We have to remember that the caliber of politicians in the United States is atrociously low. So people such as Pelosi are hoping to enter the textbooks of history as being the ones who played a vital role in the defeat of the Russian army and in the subsequent downfall of Vladimir Putin. But at the same time, the Americans understand in private that the Russians are winning the war in Ukraine. They understand that the Ukraine which existed prior to the 24th of February 2022 will never, ever return. They understand that a new and enlarged Russian state is in the making. So by visiting Kiev, Pelosi and other American politicians are attempting to bolster the morale of the Ukrainian ruling elite and of the Ukrainian armed forces, together with the morale of Ukrainian paramilitaries at what is a perilous time for them. And as regards to the origins of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, we have to be mindful that for 30 years, beginning in 1992, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Moscow asked, told, warned America not to extend its tentacles to Ukraine, because Ukraine is of vital importance to Russian national security and is absolutely imperative to the Russian national identity. If Russia was to extend its tentacles to Canada and Mexico, I would thoroughly condemn that. Why? Because it would be dangerous for global peace and global security.
Sure. Ian Williams, would you like to respond?
This concept has been used by other people. The last person to use it called it Lebensraum. He said the Germans had a destiny to take over their neighbors. This is what we have here. We have Russisch Lebensraum. We have the Russians saying that they have a manifest destiny. This is a bit like Britain saying, we owned Ireland for 800 years. It's ours, really. We go back in and get it anytime. This type of atavistic empire building from the Slavic swamps. Remember, the Russian state was actually born in Ukraine. If anything, the Ukrainians should be taking over Moscow, which was a Mongol-ruled swamp when the Rus was a pinnacle of civilization on the steppes there. This is atavistic, proves nothing at all. This is an evocation of history to promote Lebensraum. It's a bit like the Zionist claim to Israel. Our ancestors may have been there 3,000 years ago, so we can go and take it now and heaven help the people who are in it. It's got no relation. Now, on the case of Pelosi, I haven't got much time for Pelosi or American politicians, but I will say Pelosi and Biden and Angelina Jolie have actually gone into war zones to show their support. Vladimir Putin would only meet the Secretary General of the United Nations across a table the length of a football pitch because he's so scared that someone is going to poison him. And why is he so scared they're going to poison him? Because his laboratories, his FSB and his people are providing the wherewithal to do so, and have done so to the opposition at home and abroad. This is, we're in once again, an Alice in Wonderland world.
All right.
No time for Pelosi and the general principles,
yes.
but I admire her.
Before you jump in, Marcus Papadopoulos and Ian Williams, both of you, I'd like to first thank for not interrupting each other while you were speaking, though you both disagree. But I'd like to ask both, if you'd like, you can jump in so we can make this more lively. And I say that because, in essence, we're running out of time. So, Marcus Papadopoulos, go ahead. But, of course, let's try to do it so that we can understand what each other is saying. Go ahead, Marcus.
Indeed. I abhor all forms of racism. And what I heard just now from the guest in New York was racism towards Russians. Referring to Russia as a swamp is absolutely disgusting. I would also like to say this. I would also like to say that. I would also like to say. I would also like to say this as well. Would you not interrupt me? Democracy is partly about respecting other people's opinions and allowing other people to speak. Now, in regard to the significance of Ukraine to Russia, if the gentleman in New York is so very au fait with the history of both Russia and Ukraine, then perhaps he can explain to me and to our audience the significance of 1654, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, and Bogdan Khmelnytsky. I suspect he will have great difficulties in being able to do that. The truth of the matter is that, with the exception of the westernmost parts of Ukraine, namely Ternopil, Lvov, Ivano-Frankivsk, Rivne, and Volyn, the rest of Ukraine is directly linked to Russia and the Russian people. They are the same people. Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians are East Slavs. Much of the Ukrainian population are members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Again, you are interrupting me. Again, you are interrupting me. You are not being respectful. I have referred to what I have responded to what you said, and now I will give way to you. That is partly what democracy is about.
Ian Williams, go ahead.
Excuse me, I've got. The moderator said we should cut in with each other. I am very sorry, Marco, on this, but I kept my quiet. But when you come out with absolute rubbish, I do have to contradict and get in there. This Slavic mysticism is the only essence of ideology left for Putin apart from his naked grasp for power. He has repudiated Lenin. He's repudiated socialism. He's driven the autarkic Russian economy, which fought the Second World War. And now he's denigrating it left, right, and center. I presume he's now going to repudiate Lend-Lease when those fearsome, nasty Americans and British risked their lives. My father was on the Murmansk convoys, taking weapons to Soviet Russia during the Second World War, which were given for free. Maybe that was just an attempt, an imperialist attempt to create an arms market in the Soviet Union. But all that seems to be forgotten now. There were points when we were all together and we were fighting a brutal threat. That seems to be forgotten. The brutal threat now is Vladimir Putin.
Well,
What's he done for Russia?
Can you? I got to jump in here. I'm sorry, Ian Williams. When you say that, that's kind of what Lloyd Austin said, and many are critiquing him for saying that, in a sense, because it kind of parallels what you said, in which he said the U.S. goal in this war is to weaken Russia over the long term. And some are saying that, well, the U.S. then lied, because that's not what it said in the beginning. In the beginning, it wanted to end what it called a insurgency that was going on, and then it went on to say there should be some peace efforts to happen. But now it has come out and said, no, our aim is to weaken Russia. It wasn't the U.S. that's weakened Russia. It's Putin. He could have concentrated on building up the economy, giving a decent standard of living, providing social welfare for his people. Okay. Instead, he plowed his oil money into not even infrastructure. His whole oil industry is now dependent on Western technology. Stalin and Lenin and the others would be turning their graves at what he's done.
to the Soviet industry and system that was built up by the blood of the workers since its May Day now. He has given it all away to his billionaire pals who relied upon imported technology, imported technicians, and currency trading. He has blown it. He has blown Russia. He has got NATO to the shores of Finland. He has also, by the way, since we're talking about strategic arms stuff, he has managed to single-handedly destroy nuclear non-proliferation. No country in the world.
Marcus Papadopoulos, let me ask Marcus to jump in. Marcus Papadopoulos,
Putin managed to rip up the guarantees to
you
Ukraine.
had the U.S. Secretary of Defense, as they call it, Lloyd Austin, in that after the meeting that happened in Germany, where U.S. invited 40 countries, it said something that was very, in some ways, eye-opening, promising to move heaven and earth to ensure Ukraine's victory in the war. Now, we know that Secretary Lloyd Austin was immediately, after retiring from CENTCOM, to have joined the board of Raytheon Technologies. But aside from that...
whose shares have dropped, by the way, because they were selling to Russia, and those sales have been stopped by the sanctions. How is that for capitalism?
What does that show when you have the U.S. Secretary of, as they call it, Defense, make a statement like that, which squarely falls to a military solution which goes hand in hand with the U.S. goal to weaken Russia?
And Putin isn't threatening a military solution.
That's Marcus Papadopoulos. I'm sorry, Ian Williams. Marcus Papadopoulos, go ahead.
Well, first of all, the Soviet economy, which by the time of the dissolution of the USSR was the second largest in the world, was actually destroyed by the pro-Western agenda of Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. It had nothing to do with Vladimir Putin. I would also add that the gentleman in New York's knowledge of Soviet history and Russian history is not just lamentable, but it is also laughable. Now, turning to the American Defense Secretary's remarks, the Americans are attempting to inflict a military defeat on the Russian army with the knowledge that if Russia was to lose in Ukraine, and if Ukraine was to remain in the West's sphere of influence and one day join NATO, then Russia could never hope to be the superpower that it was in Soviet times. Ukraine is absolutely imperative to Russia.